So I'd like to start a series of videos now on an important work by Aristotle, and that is called the Poetics. Now, in the Poetics, it's a fairly short work, not too much, but it's packed with a lot of, typical for Aristotle, is packed with a lot of very interesting commentary and things for us to think about in all kinds of ways. So Poetics is dealing with, one could say roughly, the nature of interpreting and thinking about writing and singing and all kinds of things. Thinking about art, the interpretation of art. Some people say it's one of the earliest works of literary criticism, right? Where Aristotle is going to talk about what's going on in a work of art and how should we think about it. All right, so whatever it actually is hard to say because it's a complicated little piece, but it's very interesting, and I'm going to give you some of the highlights of it. But it definitely merits a very, very close read because simply, whether you like it or not, it's been very influential throughout history as to how writers and philosophers have thought about things like poetry and drama and all that kind of stuff that we associate with the dramatic and the literary arts. It has about 26 chapters, as I said, not too long, and the chapters are relatively short, a couple of maybe a handful of paragraphs each. I'm going to look at chapters 1 to 4, which kind of gets the whole ball rolling for Aristotle. And even then, I'm only going to give sort of a cursory look at these things because there's a lot going on in every little chapter. So he starts off by saying, okay, what's he going to talk about? He's going to speak about poetry and its species, the structure of a plot needed for a good poem, the nature of a poem's parts, and all kinds of manners of inquiry that deal with the poetic arts. And he says, I'm going to follow, as Aristotle does, I'm going to follow what's kind of a natural order and look at first principles. So Aristotle typically begins by, trying to look, sometimes he goes into a big historical analysis, which he does a little bit here. We'll talk about that a little later. But he's looking at what sort of is the underpinnings of poetry. Well, he says, first off, what's going on when we talk about poetry and drama and all that kind of stuff? Really what they are modes of imitation. So that's a key term for Aristotle, the notion of imitation, right? Now, what exactly does that mean? But, in a simple way, right? To imitate is to make representations of, to try and capture what's out there in some kind of artistic representation. So epic and tragic poetry, comedy, and he even says most flute playing and lyre playing are all viewed as a whole modes of imitation. So even music is kind of or at least in some cases, he's not clear exactly when, but in some cases, even music is a mode of imitation of the world. So this is an important thing that runs under Aristotle's thinking, is this notion of imitation. Now, they do differ, right? Because poetry and all its species, and there's different ways that we imitate. How do they differ? Well, they differ in terms of the means, like what do you use when you imitate? They differ in terms of the objects. What are you going to imitate? Basically, it's the actions of people, actions of agents. And then the manner, like how are you going to imitate these actions? How are you going to do it? How are you going to represent? And is it going to be, in an omniscient, we would say today, like an omniscient voice, like as in a narrator, a first person narrator, maybe third person. So he looks at the ways that imitation is done, and namely how they differ. So the rest of chapter 1, you can have a look at that, goes into more of the means, like things like rhythm, language, harmony. Then in chapter 2, he's going to talk a little bit about, remember that the object of imitation is really the actions of agents. So actions of good agents, some writers like to write about, really highbrow, noble actions by noble agents. And some writers like to write about things that are maybe more like us, right? So, like writers that will concentrate on sort of everyday human life and so that the average person kind of relates to it. And then some writers like to concentrate more on people that are, as Aristotle says, meaner or lesser, right? And sort of more base stuff. And so when you think about all the different ways that people can look at agency, right? Higher, us, lower. You can see why it was sort of split up into different kind of parts. And Aristotle says this is all very natural. Why? Because once again, we are natural imitators. Now, let's look a little bit more. So this imitation, yeah, it's one of the roots of poetry. It's rooted in human nature. It is basically part of what we are, and by nature, we didn't create it. It's just part of who we are. So again, keep in mind that Aristotle doesn't really try and prove things. He just says, this is just a fact of human nature. He might say you can find it in experience. He talks a little bit about that, but he doesn't give a big lengthy argument as to what. Here he doesn't, as to what human nature is and the roots of poetry and all that. No, he just says basically we're imitators. That's what we do. And we're not the only imitators, though, because other creatures imitate, Aristotle says, but nobody does it really the way we do it, to the extent. We are the most imitative of all creatures. Humans do that more than any other creature. And that's actually to our advantage as well. Now, remember, Aristotle doesn't have an evolutionary explanation for things, so he's not going to say that this advantaged us so that we could become a dominant species or something. He doesn't talk like that at all. He doesn't think like that. That's not his universe. He has this notion of human nature, and he doesn't really talk about it as being created either, right? He just says it's part of us, and it gives us advantages, but it wasn't, in an evolutionary thing. So don't put that on Aristotle. He doesn't see the world like that at all. So we have a human nature, and it's got an imitative part to it. There's other things in it as well, and not only that we do it, but we delight in it, right? We enjoy imitating. He says that's a fundamental part of us as well. We like to imitate. We like imitations. We like this stuff. So when, why do you like art? Why do you like imitation? Aristotle would think that's a weird question. As a matter of fact, he would think that a better question would be, why does someone not like art? Right? If you don't like imitation or whatever, that's odd because it's part of your nature to like it. That would be very strange according to Aristotle. So Aristotle, again, since he has a notion of human nature, it comes out in his ethics, it comes out in his metaphysics, it comes out in his, as we could say, his literary criticism. It would be a very odd question for him to be asked something like, well, why should we like art? It's what we do. We do like it. And also, not only do we delight, as everyday experience confirms this, people like art, right? Think about children. They love art, right? It's usually later on that they may grow to dislike it when they're forced to study it in some way, and then it becomes associated with something negative. Perhaps, but usually children, they like going and looking at pictures. They like that stuff, and sometimes we sadly think that humans naturally grow out of it. Well, we may be educating ourselves out of something very natural and turning people against it. But children like art, and so do most adults. Again, most adults like music, right? We like movies and music and all this stuff. And Aristotle says, yes, as it should be, because that's part of your human nature. And not only is it something that's part of our human nature to like it and to delight in it, it's also part of us to learn through imitation. So we delight in learning. We have a natural, and this then in the metaphysics, Aristotle begins it with another natural thing, is a desire to know. So Aristotle again begins a lot of his discussions with human nature. We have nature put in us sort of a desire to know. A delight in imitation, a desire to imitate, and we learn. That's how we start off learning about the world. When you think little babies and children, how do they learn about their world? They learn about it through imitation. They imitate others, right? They look at imitations and then they imitate the imitation. So imitation is just built right into us. And sometimes we use other words, like we say, oh, well, children need good. They need good models so that they can practice and imitate. They need things that are good that they can imitate. So Aristotle is basically saying, yeah, this is all quite natural. And also this delight, because if you see something like an original object, right? Let's say you see some particular object X, whatever it happens to be, and then you see it, you see this X, and then you see an imitation of X. So let's say a little imitation of X. There is a delight in this as well, because of this relationships here, right? So if you've seen an original thing and you see a really good representation or a really good imitation, and that imitation of it makes you or gives you the ability to see this in a new way, then you delight in that. And we would put that maybe in different terms today. We'd say something like, well, that was a really good piece of fiction or a really good movie. Why? Well, as I watched those characters, I kind of looked at life, which I've had some experience, or I've looked at things that I've already seen in a new way. And that's one of the classic sort of notions of art. A great piece of art will give you an experience or some kind of imitation of reality that will make you look at reality that you've already experienced with in a new way. You will learn something new. Yeah, I learned a lot more about the world by reading that fiction, that piece of fiction, or looking at this sculptor or whatever. It gives me some new kind of experience through the imitation, and then because I've seen the original, I see how that imitation relates to the original. I learn something. I enjoy it. Once again, that's the whole point of exercising your human nature. All right. So, and Aristotle says there's lots of other things that are natural to us too, like rhythm and harmony. That's natural, right? So when you hear something, you go, "Oh, that's catchy," and you just start snapping your fingers or tapping your toes. Or you want to dance. That's a natural reaction. Aristotle would say that's part of human nature, is to like imitation, you like rhythm. So we are kind of artistic. We often talk about we're social creatures. We are artistic creatures as well. What do children love to do? They love to draw. They love art class. Very few kids don't like art class. They like gym class. They like all kinds of things, right? And Aristotle would say, yeah, this is all quite natural. But think about children and art. I mean, most children, it's kind of sad when you think of children, most of them like to color and draw. They like art. They like to color things to try and look like something, or draw pictures of their family or whatever. Very natural stuff. And a good question is like, why is it that people stop doing that, right? If Aristotle's right and this is natural, why on earth do we stop doing that? Why is it that that we would say, oh, well, only an adult artist draws? Why don't more people just draw for amusement, for fun? And it's part of our nature. Okay, so, all right, so with this in mind, so this notion of human nature in the background that's got imitation, a delight in it, learning, it's all bound up. It's pretty natural that Aristotle would think this is an important thing, and it's had an important influence on history. So in the beginning then, so art for Aristotle in the beginning is just kind of this mass, this undifferentiated sort of mass of imitation. That's what we're doing. And poetry, so art, right? Like in the beginning, poetry it just includes all the different species. It hasn't really become divided, and so poetry eventually starts to emerge and divide according to the characters of the poets themselves. So some poets, right? So it will start to divide according to the characters of the poets, right? Not the characters in the play, but the very characters of the poets themselves. So, for instance, it's not that complicated. So if you tend to be interested in and stimulated by the actions of agents that are better than you are, you're going to write a certain kind of poetry. And that's eventually going to kind of lead off into things like tragedy. But if you're interested in actions of people that maybe are lesser and kind of, the follies of them, you're going to write about those. And that's going to create sort of the poetry, and eventually that will lead into things like comedy. So the actions that you want to imitate are dependent upon the kind of character you are. Those will be the kinds of characters you want to write about, says Aristotle. So, and as they, so the more serious poets, looked at the noble actions, the actions of the good people, and eventually goes off into tragedy. And again, the lesser goes off into comedy. So Aristotle is telling a little bit of history here, and he doesn't claim it's a big, history, like he's really doing it all justice. He's just giving some ideas here, and he says, if I wanted to talk about it all, it'd be another treatise, but I'm not really doing that here. So as the different parts of imitation, then, of the different things that you want to imitate, the different means and all that, it started to break up, and then conventions start coming in. And Aristotle says, in places that, well, this poet said there should be 2 episodes, and this poet said there should be 3, and this many characters, and sort of rules and conventions started to grow up. And that is, again, what Aristotle is saying, that's kind of, like artificial, like we did that, but it's all rooted in something that's not artificial, something that's very natural. So this is a natural outgrowth of something that is natural, and could have been slightly different as history were different, but it would all still stem from this notion of human nature, which has imitation and delight and learning all mixed up in it. So there's another thing that Aristotle just says is also very natural to us, in addition to imitation and delight, and that's this. Creativity. So, and in other words, improvising, right? So not only do we imitate, we improvise. So there's creativity built right into us, right? That's a natural thing as well. Again, look to children for these kinds of things. They're often very creative little creatures. They say the wildest things, and sometimes it's random, and sometimes it's just it's hard to say the difference between creativity and randomness, but they are indeed creative little creatures. They draw, they imitate, they change things up, they mix things up, right? They color outside the lines, and then you bring in a convention, you say you must color in the lines. And kids are like, why, right? And think about the way kids represent things. They're very creative in their representations, right? And so sometimes you have to ask them, like, what's going on there? And then they'll tell you, well, that's you, or that's a sky, or whatever, and they draw them very differently. But it's still a kind of imitation, but it's, again, one that's very creative. And Aristotle says, yeah, that's exactly what was going on in the early days of this. That this was kind of this blobby, undifferentiated mass, and it was just all here. And then throughout history, they start to divide, and you get all different kinds of things through the actions of improvisations, creativity. Different characters of poets are concerned with different things, and then you get this more complex and different poetry and its species that Aristotle says that we have when he was writing today. And he does make another note that really the serious stuff, is the tragedy. So he implicitly seems to debase comedy from the beginning. Like, life is really important. That's the tragic stuff. And maybe for more sheer amusement. But Aristotle thinks all of this art is important because it's cathartic. We'll look at that a little bit later. But again, not only is a lot of this natural, even the ways of speaking in meter, sometimes if you've had to read certain kinds of poetry, when it's in a metered form, right, it has a certain rhythm. Well, rhythms and those things are natural as well, Aristotle says. And he says, for instance, that iambic, which is kind of like this, the dum, right, is a certain kind of pattern where it's sort of 2 syllables, one unstressed and the other stressed, kind of like some people say, like heartbeat, right, bum, bum, right, the second one is the stressed. He said this is a very natural way of speaking. We often will speak in iambic, right? Then, how many iambic parts, make up, and then you'll get certain kinds of meters. I'm not going to go into all that. But if you think of iambic, we'll say it, we will often emphasize the second part of a small combination of two syllables, right? The soft or the unstressed and then the stressed. Again, like a heartbeat, bum, 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 right? A lot of Shakespeare's lines are written in iambic pentameter. So there's 5 of these little iambs in a line. So it's bum bum, and then that will go 5 times. That's a kind of, not so much the pentameter, but the iambic is a very natural way of speaking, Aristotle says. Hexameter, not so much. That's a much more complicated way. And Homer wrote in hexameter, and Aristotle says, yeah, that's a much more advanced and not as natural, but it's not like the iambic, which we naturally will speak of. So again, the most important things is this is all very natural that we do this art and all this. So it also seems that we have a natural interest in examining it. So the first 4 chapters more or less get, shall we say, to use an old cliche, the ball rolling. So we'll come back and pick up a little bit more in the rest of these videos. Stay tuned.